In April 2011, on the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee, everyone advised Hannah Whitaker, 48 years old, to sell the 91-acre farm her husband had left her after dying of a heart attack 8 months earlier. Keeping it will only cost you everything, the real estate agent said. The bank kept sending collection notices. Even the neighbors believed she would soon give up. The farm was nearly dead. The livestock barn was rotting. The pastures had been swallowed by brambles. The fences had collapsed. The creek was blocked by fallen trees. And the northern woods were so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. One morning, when Hannah went to the feed store in town, a man watched her old pickup truck and laughed loudly. That's the widow still trying to hold on to the widow's worthless farm. The person standing next to him shook his head. 91 acres just to grow weeds. Hannah did not reply. She loaded rolls of wire and bags of seed onto the truck and quietly drove away. To keep that land, she had sold her small apartment in Nashville, withdrawn nearly all her savings, and accepted living alone in the old, deteriorating log house. The next 3 years passed in days of mending fences, clearing the creek, patching the barn roof, and trying to keep the farm from being repossessed by the bank. Even though she worked from sunrise to dark, nothing seemed to improve. In early spring of 2014, while digging a drainage ditch on the northern hillside, Hannah's hoe suddenly struck an unusually soft layer of soil beneath the leaf mold. She bent down and brushed the leaves aside. A very faint fragrance rose from the earth, unlike anything she had ever known. Hannah looked for only a few seconds and then continued her work, completely unaware that she had just touched the farm's greatest secret. Hidden beneath that forgotten forest was something no one in Cumberland County had ever sought. Not the neighbors, not the bank, and not even Hannah herself. When the truth was finally revealed, those who had once laughed at the widow's worthless farm would be the first to wish they had never laughed. Before returning to the Cumberland Plateau, Hannah Whitaker, 48 years old, had been a human resources manager at a manufacturing company in Nashville, Tennessee. She had a steady job, a small apartment near downtown, and a life many considered enviable. But every afternoon, amid the crowded streets and glass buildings, Hannah always felt she was living in a place that had never truly belonged to her. The one who always longed for the Tennessee hills was her husband, Daniel Whitaker. He had grown up on the family farm itself and believed the northern woods were worth more than any field. Each time they returned, Daniel would walk alone into the forest for hours. When Hannah asked what he was looking for, he only smiled. There are things that appear only to those who know how to wait. He never said more. After Daniel died of a sudden heart attack, everything changed in just a few weeks. Their daughter wanted to sell the farm to pay off debts. Friends urged Hannah to return to Nashville before it was too late. The bank sent a final notice. She had only 60 days to pay the overdue loan before foreclosure proceedings began. Then Caleb Turner, who owned the largest farm in the area and was the most influential voice in Cumberland County, stopped by. When Caleb Turner said a piece of land was no longer valuable, most people believed him. Caleb looked around at the rotting barn, the collapsed fences, and shook his head. Don't let memory cost you your future. Hannah did not argue, but those words stayed with her all night. While clearing out Daniel's study, she found a worn, leather-bound notebook. The early pages recorded rainfall, wind direction, tree species, and sketches of the northern woods. On the last page was a sentence underlined twice. Don't ask what the land can give you. Ask what it wants to become. What made Hannah pause was not that sentence, nor the sketch of the northern hillside, but the fact that Daniel had marked one particular spot on the map at least 7 times over 10 years, each time with a different ink color, yet had never written any explanation. A few weeks later, Hannah quit her job, sold the apartment in Nashville, and moved permanently to the farm. She did not come seeking wealth. She only wanted to keep the final promise to the husband she loved. Years later, Hannah finally understood why that question mark on the map had been circled so many times by Daniel. Moving back to the Cumberland Plateau was the hardest decision of Hannah Whitaker's life, but she quickly realized that surviving on that land was far harder still. The first month passed in hope. Every morning, Hannah rose before sunrise, cut grass by hand, rebuilt each section of fence, and cleared the fallen branches blocking the creek. Every evening, she opened Daniel's notebook, recorded what she had done that day, and told herself that if she just persevered a little longer, everything would gradually improve. Yet the second month brought an entirely different reality. Every completed task led to many new problems. When she replaced the first fence boards, she discovered nearly half the wooden posts had rotted from below and had to be dug up and replaced. When she cleared the creek bed, a heavy weekend rain washed all the tree trunks downstream, destroying the dirt road she had just graded. When she climbed up to repair the old barn roof, Hannah realized the interior beams had been hollowed out by termites years earlier. A roof that seemed to need only a few sheets of tin suddenly became an entire structure that had to be rebuilt almost from scratch. Her savings began to dwindle faster than she had expected. Hannah decided the farm had to generate its own income. She built a small chicken coop for eggs, but only a few weeks later a fox killed nearly the entire flock in one night. She switched to planting pumpkins and tomatoes to sell at the weekend farmers market, but that summer's prolonged drought cut the yield in half. She used the dry tree trunks to cut firewood to sell to local residents, but the money earned was only enough to buy fuel for the old pickup. Then Hannah tried placing a few beehives at the edge of the pasture, hoping to sell honey. But a long, rainy spring weakened the colonies, and they produced almost nothing. Every plan began with hope and ended in disappointment. By the first winter, the pressure grew even heavier. Daniel's old tractor suddenly broke its transmission just when Hannah needed to clear the road after a snowstorm. The well gradually ran dry from the previous long dry season, forcing her to haul water tanks from town. Then a heavy early spring rain completely collapsed the rear wall of the old storage shed, washing away nearly all the remaining livestock feed. Hannah began to understand why so many previous landowners had given up. One afternoon, a neighbor named Walter Brooks stopped by. Walter had lived in Cumberland County nearly all his life and had watched more than a few families sell their land and leave. He stood looking at the field covered in weeds and said slowly, "Hard work cannot turn bad land into good land." It was not mockery. Walter truly believed Hannah was destroying her own life for a promise no one could verify. Hannah only smiled. But that evening, when she opened the drawer to take out her notebook, she discovered the remaining money in her account was enough to last only a few more weeks. The next morning, she called a real estate agent in town and asked about the selling price of the farm. The agent scheduled a survey for the end of the week. After hanging up, Hannah sat for a long time on the porch. Wind from the northern woods blew through the old oaks, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth that Daniel had always loved. She remembered the question mark circled so many times in his notebook. By mid-afternoon, Hannah stood up, put the phone in her coat pocket, took the hoe, and walked straight toward the northern woods. If she truly had to sell this farm, she wanted at least once to look carefully at the place Daniel had quietly returned to for nearly 10 years. Hannah did not know that the decision that seemed only meant to close a chapter was actually the first step leading her to the greatest secret this land had kept for many generations. That afternoon, Hannah Whitaker carried Daniel's old hoe straight into the northern woods. This was the place she had always postponed for 3 years, thinking it had no value beyond old trees and a thick layer of leaf mold. The deeper she went, the weaker the light became. Tall white oaks sealed off the sky. Vines wrapped around the trunks. The ground was so soft that every step sank into leaves that had decayed through many winters. Hannah began clearing the low brush, pulling dry branches aside, and digging a small ditch to channel rainwater off the hillside. After nearly an hour, the hoe suddenly struck an unusually soft patch of earth, not rock nor like tree roots. She bent down and brushed the leaf mold aside with her hands. Before her were a few small mounds rising very slightly, as if something beneath had just pushed the ground up. When the soil was opened, a very gentle fragrance drifted into the air. It was not like the mushrooms she had bought at the market, nor like rotting wood or earth after rain. It was a scent hard to describe, damp yet sweet, with a hint of roasted nuts. Hannah stood silent for several minutes, then took out her phone and photographed a few pictures. She remembered the question mark Daniel had circled so many times on the map in his notebook. This exact spot. This very hillside. The next morning, Hannah sent those photographs to the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Extension Office. 2 days later, she received a call from Dr. Ethan Cole, a researcher of forest fungal systems. Ethan offered no conclusions over the phone. He asked only one question: "Can you leave everything as it is until I arrive?" 3 days later, Ethan appeared with a backpack full of tools. What surprised Hannah was that he barely looked at what had just been exposed under the ground. Instead, he spent many hours walking through the entire forest. He observed the white oaks more than half a century old. He noted the positions of the hazel bushes growing under the canopy. He dug many soil samples at different depths to check drainage and pH. He picked up handfuls of leaf mold, squeezed them gently in his hands, and sniffed for a long time. Occasionally, he stopped simply to listen to the water flowing underground after the previous week's rain. When the sun was nearly behind the hillside, Ethan finally returned to where Hannah was standing. He smiled, but it was not the smile of someone who had just found a few valuable mushrooms. "The most precious thing here is not under your feet," he said slowly. "It is in this entire forest." Ethan explained that what Hannah had seen was only a very small sign of a rare ecosystem. The oaks, the hazels, the thick leaf mold accumulated over many years, the stable groundwater, the well-drained soil, and the millions of microorganisms underground were all coexisting in a very special way. No human could create that system in just a few years. It had to have been built by nature over many decades. He continued, "Many people think you only need to plant the right kind of mushrooms to get results, but that is not true. There are things that cannot be forced to grow." Hannah listened in silence. Ethan looked toward the northern woods, where the last rays of sunlight were filtering through the canopy, and spoke the sentence Hannah would remember for the rest of her life. "You do not own the forest. You are only caring for it." For the first time since Daniel's death, Hannah felt she was no longer trying to save a dying farm. Perhaps what she needed to learn was not how to change this land, but how to understand what it had quietly preserved long before she ever set foot there. After that survey, Hannah Whitaker did not dig anything more under the northern woods. Nor did she take the first samples to sell, as many people assumed she would. Ethan Cole explained that if she harvested right then, she would gain only a small sum of money and might destroy the entire ecosystem that had taken decades to form. What Hannah possessed was not a few rare specimens. The most valuable thing was the ability of the whole forest to continue producing them for many years to come. For the first time, Hannah understood why Daniel had always spent hours walking in that forest and brought almost nothing home. He was not searching for something he could hold in his hands. He was trying to understand how the forest worked. From that day, Hannah's life changed completely. During the day, she still did the familiar work of a farm owner. But every evening, the small table in the log house was covered with books on forest fungi, ecology, and forest soils. She registered for University of Tennessee workshops on symbiotic fungal systems. On weekends, she drove hundreds of miles to attend workshops for forest owners in Kentucky and North Carolina. She visited long-established understory farms, listened more than she spoke, and always carried Daniel's notebook in her backpack. Beside her husband's old notes, Hannah began adding her own observations. She marked the position of every white oak, every hazel bush, recorded weekly rainfall, soil temperature, pH, moisture, and even the times of year when insects were most abundant. She realized the underground fungal network did not exist in isolation. It lived through a symbiotic web with tree roots, groundwater, and millions of microorganisms invisible to the human eye. Change just one link and the whole system would react. In the first year after she began learning, a prolonged drought killed many young trees. Hannah did not rush to replant. She studied the cause and adjusted the way she retained moisture in the leaf mold rather than watering more. The following autumn, forest mice damaged many newly recovered areas. Instead of setting traps everywhere, she planted additional native trees to attract owls and natural predators. Some years, the first underground signs nearly disappeared completely. Hannah spent many weeks discovering that an old ditch had altered the groundwater flow after heavy rains. She did not blame the weather. She repaired the drainage system and patiently waited another season. The more she learned, the more Hannah understood that every failure was only the expression of a deeper problem. If you only fix the symptom, the problem would return. If you fix the system correctly, the entire forest would balance itself. Daniel's notebook grew thicker with new notes. Many old pages were supplemented in Hannah's own handwriting. At times, she suddenly realized that the places Daniel had marked years earlier were all where the oaks were healthiest and the leaf mold thickest. He had not known exactly what lay underground, but he had sensed that the forest was trying to tell him something. Hannah's change also gradually altered the way those around her saw her. Walter Brooks still often stopped by to help mend fences or haul large logs after every storm. At first, he helped only because he did not want to see a widow work herself to exhaustion. But later, Walter grew curious about the way Hannah cared for the forest. One early autumn morning, the two stood silently watching sunlight filter through the oak canopy after a night rain. Walter bent down, picked up a handful of leaf mold, and let it fall back to the ground. He smiled and shook his head as if he had just realized something he had never considered in his entire life. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the forest is teaching us." Hannah did not answer. She only looked toward the hillside where Daniel had marked in the notebook. For the first time in many years, she no longer felt she was trying to save a failed farm. She was learning to become part of the system that nature had patiently built long before any human set foot in this place. And she began to believe that if she continued to listen, the forest would eventually answer the remaining questions that Daniel had never had time to solve. 8 years had passed since the day Hannah Whitaker first stepped into the northern woods with Daniel's old hoe. Throughout that time, she had never tried to make the forest grow faster than nature intended. She had only patiently kept it healthier each year. The white oaks continued to grow. The leaf mold grew thicker after every autumn. The groundwater flowed in the right direction once the drainage system had been adjusted. Birds, squirrels, and insects that had once disappeared gradually returned. The forest did not change in a single season. It changed very slowly, almost imperceptibly without Hannah's notebook that thickened day by day. In early autumn of the 8th year, Ethan Cole returned to the Cumberland Plateau as he had once promised. He walked nearly the entire day through the forest, stopping at the places Daniel had marked years earlier and comparing them with Hannah's new notes. Late in the afternoon, Ethan set the notebook down, looked around the forest once more and smiled. "It's time," he said. Those were the 2 words Hannah had waited nearly a decade to hear. The first harvest took place early the next morning. There were no reporters, no television cameras, no banners or speeches. Only Hannah, Ethan, and 3 helpers moving quietly through the still misty woods. They worked slowly and carefully, as if afraid of waking the forest itself. Every spot was carefully checked before digging. After the needed material was taken, the soil and leaf mold were replaced exactly as before. Ethan always reminded everyone of one thing. "We are harvesting today so the forest can keep giving for another 10 years. By the end of the day, the amount gathered was not large. Far less than outsiders imagined for a rare product. But Ethan looked at the neat small wooden crates and nodded with satisfaction. Quality was what mattered. A few weeks later, the first shipment was sent to a Michelin-starred restaurant in Tennessee. The chef did not merely buy the product. He also wanted to know how it was created. To him, the greatest value did not lie in what was placed on the plate, but in the entire forest that had nurtured it for many years. The first payment Hannah received did not turn her into a millionaire overnight the way many stories people like to tell. It was only enough for her to pay off the remaining bank loan in full, repair the deteriorated log house, replace the old barn roof, expand the forest's conservation area, and hire a few local workers. But for the first time since Daniel's death, Hannah no longer had to worry that the farm would be sold the following winter. In the years that followed, production increased very slowly but steadily. Hannah refused to expand by cutting more forest or altering the ecosystem for greater profit. She expanded only when the forest allowed it. What surprised many people most was that Hannah never sold spawn or advertised that anyone could do the same. When forest owners from Kentucky, Virginia, and then North Carolina came seeking to learn, they often asked which trees to buy, how much money to invest, or how long it would take to see results. Hannah always shook her head. She first led them on a walk through the forest. She pointed to the old oaks, the thick leaf mold, the groundwater streams, and the sections of woods she had decided never to harvest. Then she showed them the notebook Daniel had begun, and that she herself had continued for many years. Hannah said she had no secret formula to sell. The only thing she could share was how to observe, how to keep records, and how to patiently listen to one's own forest. Some people were disappointed not to receive a simple answer. But many others began to understand what Ethan had said years earlier. No 2 forests are alike, just as no 2 pieces of land need to be treated the same way. Gradually, Hannah's farm became known not only for its rare product, but also for the free workshops offered to forest owners who wanted to restore land rather than exhaust it. The most valuable thing she created was no longer what grew underground. It was an entirely different way of looking at the land. Hannah did not build a business merely to sell a product. She built a community that knew how to care for the forest, so the forest could continue caring for people for generations to come. 15 years after the day Hannah Whitaker stepped into the northern woods, intending to clear the last remaining ground before selling the farm, The place had become a familiar destination for forest owners, researchers, and families wanting to learn how to live in harmony with nature. People did not come seeking a formula for quick wealth. They came to learn how to observe a forest before thinking of harvesting it. Every spring, dozens of groups of students from across Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina walked beneath the white oaks with Hannah. There was no classroom with a blackboard or projector. The lesson began with the morning bird song, the leaf mold underfoot, the groundwater after rain, and the tree trunks that had stood longer than anyone in the group. Hannah always said that nature is never in a hurry, yet it has never missed a season. If people could learn that rhythm, many mistakes would never occur. Daniel's notebook, which once held only a few dozen pages of notes, was now many times thicker. Hannah still preserved her husband's first lines exactly as they were. She only continued writing beneath them in her own hand. The notebook no longer belonged solely to Daniel or to Hannah. It had become a document many forest owners asked permission to read, not to copy, but to understand how one person learned to listen to the land year after year. One late autumn afternoon, when the oak leaves began turning copper gold, Walter Brooks leaned on his cane and slowly climbed onto the porch of the log house. He was past 80. His hair was nearly all white. The hands that had once been used to holding a hammer and saw now trembled slightly whenever he poured tea. Hannah brought out 2 wooden chairs. The 2 of them sat looking at the northern woods in the soft late daylight. A long time later, Walter finally spoke. "I still remember the day I told you hard work cannot turn bad land into good land." Hannah laughed. "I remember too." Walter looked at the forest in front of them and asked in a deeper voice, "In your opinion, what changed this land?" Hannah did not answer at once. She looked at the rows of white oaks swaying gently in the wind. The hazel bushes still grew exactly where Ethan had pointed out years earlier. The sound of a woodpecker echoed from far away. The small creek still flowed along the path Daniel had once drawn in the notebook. At last, Hannah smiled very softly. Nothing changed. Walter turned to look at her. Hannah continued, "Only I did." Walter was silent a long time and then nodded slightly. He understood. For the past 15 years, the forest had not become more valuable because people discovered its worth. It had always been that way for a very long time. What changed was that one person finally took the time to understand what nature had always been quietly saying. A few days later, Hannah led a new group of students to the exact spot where she had first discovered those small mounds of earth years earlier. The area was enclosed by a low wooden fence. No one was allowed to dig. No one was allowed to harvest. A small sign beside the path simply read, "The First Conservation Area, where every journey begins." Someone asked why she did not harvest the place with the best quality. Hannah only smiled. "Some places do not exist to bring profit. They exist to remind us why we began." She bent down, picked up a freshly fallen oak leaf, placed it back on the leaf mold, and gently covered it. That was also the way Ethan had done it during the first harvest. And it was the way Daniel had always walked through the forest, years before anyone understood what he was seeking. Hannah suddenly remembered the sentence Daniel had written on the last page of the notebook. "Don't ask what the land can give you. Ask what it wants to become." It had taken her nearly 20 years to truly understand the full meaning of those words. When she was young, she had always thought land was an asset that needed to be exploited to create value. Later, she realized the greatest value appears only when people stop forcing nature to become what they want and begin helping it become what it was always meant to be. Hannah also never forgot Ethan Cole's words on that first afternoon in the northern woods. "You do not own the forest. You are only caring for it." Whenever anyone asked whom this farm belonged to, Hannah always answered that she was merely the person entrusted with the responsibility of guarding it for a very short span of history. The forest had existed before her, and one day it would continue to exist after she was no longer here. Walter Brooks also left Hannah a lesson she always retold to her students. Years earlier, he had said, "Hard work cannot turn bad land into good land." At the time, Hannah thought Walter was wrong. But the longer she lived, the more she understood he had spoken only half the truth. Hard work is necessary, yet hard work alone is not enough. If done the wrong way, a person can labor a lifetime and still never draw closer to what they seek. Only when hard work is paired with understanding do the small actions truly make a difference. That is also what Hannah always reminded those who came to learn. Do not begin with the question of how to harvest more. Begin with the question of what is making your land healthier or weaker each day. Because when the system is understood correctly, the results will arrive at their own proper time. Late in the afternoon, the sun gradually disappeared behind the oak canopy. The camera slowly pulled back from the porch, crossed the small dirt road, and stopped at the first conservation area, where the earliest underground signs had once changed Hannah Whitaker's life. No one touched that place anymore. It was still kept exactly as it was, a thank you to the forest that had patiently waited for a person calm enough to listen. There are people who spend their entire lives trying to turn life into what they think they need. They chase opportunities far away without realizing that the most precious thing has sometimes always been right beneath their feet. Not because it was hidden too well, but because they never stopped long enough to see it. Sometimes what changes our lives is not finding a new piece of land, but learning to understand more deeply the land we are already standing on. Just as a seed germinates only when it meets the right conditions, every person has their own piece of land that needs to be quietly cultivated with patience, understanding, and trust. Thank you for walking with us to the end of this story. If Hannah's story makes you think of someone who is persistently pursuing what they believe in, please share this video with them. We would also love to read in the comments about the seed or the piece of land you are quietly tending in your own life. And if you enjoy stories about the wisdom of survival, perseverance, and values the world has carelessly overlooked, please subscribe to the channel so we may continue the journey together in the ones that follow.